We'd love to hear a little bit more from each of you just about what got you started in this space. So, Colleen, can we start with you?
Sure, and I'd say it's been accidental. I started my career in mining, and so I've been around resource development most of my life. My dad's a geological engineer, and I have family roots both in the ag and forestry sectors in British Columbia as well. Um, and I share that in part to say I'll come back to that tenure in BC at the end, but renewable energy was starting to grow in this province in the 2000s, and so accidentally got involved with a company building small hydro and then wind development, and it's turned into a passion that also opened up my eyes on climate. And I think it's all become more acute for me in the last few years as I became a parent and desperately do not want my son to have to attend sessions like this and worry about climate policy and ZEV mandates and all these things. I hope we can solve it so that his generation can live in that better world that we're all working towards. And then with the life experience here in British Columbia, I would also add that I'm passionate about the opportunity this province has to thrive and lead the world in showing how this can happen. We have an amazing toolbox we'll unpack later to look at. And so I think those two passions, better world for my son and this province really shining through it, are the two things that motivate me.
Thank you, Colleen. Evan, let's go to you next.
Yeah, I don't know if it's rare or not, but I'll say I'm one of those rare people who my journey actually did start with a book. I read Climate Wars by Gwen Dyer when I was still in university, and it just hit, I was in political science, and it just hit this moment where it was, throughout the rest of my life, climate is going to be one of, if not the defining issue that's going to shape economies, shape politics, shape how Canada moves forward. So I did a huge pivot, and when one of Canada's sort of preeminent climate scientists, and Andrew Weaver, was running for office in BC, it was an opportunity for me to get involved, roll up my sleeves, get my hands a little dirty, and trying to figure out how do we bring climate action into sort of a political environment. So it's not necessarily a partisan question for me. It's always been how do we really solve the human, the economic challenges? And now with Clean Energy Canada, and as Colleen mentioned, we'll get to some of this a bit later, but now that we're in the transition, we need to figure out how we're going to sort of re-engineer all the systems that underpin our economy. And that's really where we get an opportunity to do that with Clean Energy Canada.
Thank you, Evan. And John, let's go to you next.
Oh gosh, I haven't told this story in a long time, but I was originally going to be a lawyer and got turned on to environmental sciences by a professor at UVic named Phil Durden, who just gave these incredible lectures about golf courses and all the terrible things that he saw going on in the world. And so I dropped out of pre-law and did environmental studies. And then did a deal with my dad to go get a real job in the oil and gas industry for a few years. But for the last 25 years, I've been building clean technology companies. And I'm so happy to see Dan Sparica, who's an old colleague of mine, on the line as well, from Nextera. But I feel like at this moment, with what we're doing at CO280, I've been training my entire career to begin working on how we can change the conversation around adoption and deployment of large scale clean technology projects that can actually have a massive impact. And I'm looking forward to the discussion today to talk more about that.
Fantastic. Well, you've all got sterling backgrounds. I'm really interested to see where our conversation takes us today. But as you know, I really like to frame the transition, the economic transition, not just as a sort of existential climate threat, but as a tremendous economic opportunity. I think the biggest economic opportunity in a century, actually. And when opportunity comes knocking, you need to be ready and to seize it and to take some really intentional steps. So let's talk a little bit about that. What is the economic benefit that BC could enjoy as we transition to a cleaner, greener world. And Evan, I'm going to kick off with you.
Yeah, I think where I start in when thinking about the economic opportunity for BC is really to understand the scale of what we're talking about. So first off, the energy transition is fundamentally a transition from a fuel-based energy system to a materials-based energy system. And that underpins absolutely everything. That's gasoline to car batteries, that's, natural gas on our grids to wind and solar and storage technologies and smart grids. So there's this sort of physical material and innovation around energy and opportunity there. But there's also all the processes. When we're talking about transforming something as fundamental as that entire energy system that underpins it, we're talking about mining, we're talking about manufacturing, we're talking about software, both process innovation, new materials, new processes, new supply chains. So really, we're reworking the entirety of how our economy and how our systems have worked. And BC is not an exception here. So we often get really focused, I think, in BC on the electricity sector, 98% clean electricity, and we think BC is already there. 70% of the energy use in British Columbia today comes from fossil fuels. So we have an immense way to go across energy systems that we don't think about outside of the electricity sector. BC has huge competitive advantages, whether that's workforce, the innovation community that's been well fostered here, connection to markets. But as I know we'll get to later on, this is something that is going to require deliberate action. It's not just something that's going to come to us and arrive at BC's doorstep. So I think maybe leave it there, but I think the scale of what we're talking about is really where the opportunity for BC sits more than anything else.
Thank you. Colleen.
Yeah, I think just to build on a couple of things Evan said, he said a lot of the things I would have said had I been first, which is great. But with BC being ahead in terms of our electricity system already being predominantly non-emitting, gives us the advantage if we hustle here to show what's that next step and the solutions that we can develop here in this province to transition the rest of the energy ecosystem to a non-emitting form is something that's exportable to the rest of the world once they get caught up. And so I think we've got this head start that we've been squandering effectively as we've sort of sat and said, oh, no, we're good. No, we're good. Well, there's solutions there we could be deploying. And then just to give a frame on what the economic opportunity just for electricity looks like, because that's Interject's the company I work for. I think I missed this at the beginning, is a renewable energy at the utility scale. So we do solar, wind, hydro, battery storage, green hydrogen around the globe. But looking at British Columbia, and for 2030 to meet our Clean BC climate targets through enhanced electrification, and this is a conservative mix, but we need to add about 8,000 gigawatt hours of electricity per year by 2030. If we just look at what that means for wind farms to meet that, it's 26 new 100 megawatt wind facilities. That represents $9.6 billion of investment from the private sector into the province. It's approximately 4,000 direct construction jobs, plus the indirect jobs on the operation and maintenance and supply chain. And it would represent just under $900 million to the province in annual property tax, crown land, and wind rental rates. So it's not as splashy as the big numbers we've heard from the LNG investment as that's been talked about in the province, but it's still a significant amount of capital to be deployed, a significant number of jobs. And the other piece I'll add on this is these projects are across the province. It's not all focused in one place. And so they can be regionally significant and provide economic foundation and benefits to a lot of communities that haven't participated in the energy ecosystem to date in the province.
Thank you, Colleen. Jonathan, let's go to you.
Well, I'll play cleanup here, Jill, and maybe just talk a little bit about the export opportunity for British Columbia. Let's give you a couple of data points. Today we have globally about 5,000 multinationals that have made a commitment to achieve net zero. And those commitments roll on in 2030 and 2040 and 2050. That represents over 40% of global GDP. And it is a massive amount of capital investment, both to reduce their emissions and then also to achieve net zero through carbon management, carbon reduction. And so for British Columbia, we have a huge competitive advantage in the development of innovations in clean technologies and services, and the market is out there. BC is a great market to try to pilot and demonstrate, but the global market, we live next to the biggest developer and deployer of clean technologies and solutions in every sector. As Evan mentioned, net zero covers every single sector of the economy, from mining to oil and gas to housing, transportation. And so we've got fantastic companies here, huge export opportunity for British Columbia. We need to double down on developing and deploying technology solutions from British Columbia.
I really appreciate you emphasizing that export market point. I think it's so often overlooked, and I hadn't heard that stat, but I'm stealing a whole bunch of sound bites from you guys today. So, but 5,000 multinationals committing to net zero, representing 40% of global GDP. The opportunities don't really come much bigger than that, and BC innovators are great at exporting, but we need to support them to grow and scale and achieve that kind of global success. Now, let me transition a little bit. We like to call our panels What Works, and we do that very specifically for a reason, because we don't want to dwell on problem description. We want to dwell on solution finding. And I like to make sure that the audience is equipped with some really practical steps. What can they do? What could happen next? And I'd love them to be equipped with a bit more knowledge about what actually works in the climate and the clean tech space. So thinking of it through that lens, what kind of advice and ideas and thoughts do you have for our audience? And I'm going to start with you, Colleen.
Yeah, so I think some of the things that work in BC, and I'm going to look at it through the lens of ESG and what we're seeing, the sort of requirements now on corporations to demonstrate that they're, meeting net zero, that they're meeting the appropriate social commitments. And this province has demonstrated you can do it right. You can work in collaboration and partnership with Indigenous communities and municipalities. We can harness our abundant emission-free energy to produce our products. And so what you're exporting is already de-risked from a few factors for that customer at the end of the day, as we're, again, from the ESG lens, starting to have to go deeper into scope 3, into your supply chain, to make sure what you're producing is done to those top standards. Anything produced in British Columbia is going to already be up there. So I think emphasizing that piece of our competitive advantage, and just by de facto being here, it's a story we need to tell more, but I think it's something that's worked well in this province, and we have capacity to do a lot more.
Excellent. Jonathan, let's come to you next.
Yeah, I think what works here in British Columbia from a technology perspective, innovation perspective, Jill, is that we've got a very cohesive technology industry. And what's really interesting about what's happened over the last 10 years is, we've traditionally thought about it as being different kind of vertical segments in technology. It's all blurred together now, whether it's materials or software or hardware or digital media. The lines are getting really blurry, and there's a lot of mobility in talent between and amongst those verticals, and we've got a tremendous amount of support systems in place to support innovators, and it's gotten stronger every year. So I think that has propelled British Columbia to a real leadership position. We're one of the most cohesive and largest ecosystems of clean technology innovation in the world, and we should be proud of that, and we should keep doing more.
Excellent. Evan, will you close us off on this one?
Yeah, I think that some of the most important stuff I've seen in leading to success is the ability to quantify your impact, quantify what you're doing, and be able to tell a really clear story. We're in a transition that has an immense amount of uncertainty, and that's going to color the next several decades in almost every sector. We're going to be talking about new technologies, rampant change, and we're going to have to all get a lot more comfortable with risk, because everything in front of us is going to involve a greater degree of risk and a conversation around how we share risk across different stakeholders. Moving through this space and finding success means being able to really clearly articulate what problem you're solving, how you fit in, what solution you're offering, and how you offer, how you fit into where we're going. Bringing in experts, connecting and helping decision makers understand how what you're doing connects to global markets. I can't tell you how many times the sort of conversation relies on BC activity taking place in BC, and then there's almost no real knowledge about, from an innovation side, how companies are connecting to global markets, what those supply chains are. There's an immense amount of need for better storytelling and sort of explaining your impact.
Interesting. Okay, well, let's stay on that question of sort of public policy and influencing and storytelling and persuading, because each of you are actually really active in that space, right? Evan, in your current role and your prior role at the Green Party. Colleen, because you're co-chairing the Climate Solutions Council for the Ministry of the Environment. And John, you were passed on the Premier's Technologies Council, as well as your current role with the Clean Tech CEO Alliance. So you all have a lot of real wisdom around what works in influencing policymakers. So let's explore that a little bit. Jonathan, let's start with you.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting question, and I think it very much depends on circumstances at the time. I think that what I've noticed in over the last 25 years is that policymakers are often influenced by crisis or perception of crisis. And I think they're also influenced by economic forces and economic impacts, which just hit people in the pocketbook. So they're always thinking about that. And then they're also impacted by leadership. So I'll give you a couple of examples of just stunning things that I've seen in the last little while. What's happened with the war in Ukraine. We've often thought of Europe as being kind of ponderous and slow to adopt new solutions. That event has absolutely propelled places like Germany and the Netherlands and France into a completely new way of thinking about speed, of scale, and adoption of the next generation of technologies in energy and climate. Gordon Campbell's leadership on deciding that climate was going to be important and putting in place the machinery in government to actually drive innovation very, very quickly at a public policy level. And so I think those are some examples. We need to seize the opportunity when we have a crisis. We just had one with COVID. And we have a climate crisis. We're seeing heat domes, and we're seeing floods, and we need to seize that, and we need to accelerate the pace of change.
Interesting. Okay, that's really, I really love those insights. And Colleen, let's go to you and think how you can build that conversation.
Yeah, and I think Jonathan's right. It's these externalities are what people react to. And, part of the limitation is we're running with democratic process that has 4-year electoral cycles, and the things that motivate voters and motivate politicians in turn tend to be quicker, shorter term things. And climate is not a quick, short term, easily solved problem. And so I think, part of, and this is based on my wins and struggles over the years, is it's making sure what you're asking for, connecting how it aligns with the values of the party of the day, and showing how this is in fact what they want to do. Give them the pathway on how to make it work. Strong narrative and storytelling around that, including, I think, and this is something we all need to be better at, is that inaction is also a choice. And so it's not, solving climate change costs X and you do Y. Not solving it, or recognizing solve is a big word and there's lots of pieces, but you're still incurring big costs and big headaches and not doing anything. And we know every dollar invested in mitigation today is way cheaper than rebuilding the highway every year as it washes out, or rebuilding communities after fire. Like, not mitigating those things is going to still cost the public purse, and at far greater cost in the future. And then there's a degree, you know, building that foundation so that when opportunity arises through crisis, or, you know, sometimes it's positive alignment, like the United States passing the Inflation Reduction Act last year created an ecosystem where Canada was able finally to move on a whole bunch of things that had been lobbied and pushed for a long time. So again, you have the foundation so you can seize the moment when it comes, and make sure you make best use of that short little political window to affect longer term change.
That's really helpful. And Evan, maybe you were talking about risk. You know, what is seen as safe, what is seen as risky is really changing in this new environment. But help us understand from your perspective what works in policymaking.
Yeah, I've got sort of three buckets of advice, but on the risk piece, I do think that any advice given today, there is going to be a bit of an evolving conversation about this, because that question of how do we share risk through a very uncertain transition with a world that's in, you know, less stable than the previous decades, and probably is just going to get more and more unstable. That is a live conversation, and I think it's worth thinking about how we talk in that sort of sphere, where that sort of how we share and how we move together, how we share that risk is going to be so essential. But yeah, three really practical pieces. One is relevance, one is perspective, and one is audience. So I can't do more than, I can't say it better than Colleen did around understanding and taking the time to understand what a party got elected to do. They are in there with a mandate. It's in mandate letters. It's in the policies they announce. Listen to a speech from the premier at a chamber of commerce. Like, these are the issues that drive them, that they see as important to their electoral success. Understanding how whatever you're doing connects to that, understanding the timing in the electoral cycle that you're in, those are just really key practical steps you can take to ensure whatever you're talking about is relevant to what the government views their mandate to be. On perspective, I think it's really useful to not look at government as sort of slow and unwieldy and separate, but as fundamentally trying to solve a different problem. There is incredibly good people across political offices, across civil society, across the public service, that are often trying to solve public policy challenges, not business challenges. And this is the biggest disconnect I've always seen between the private sector and public sector, is that they're not actually even agreement on the problem definition. A business reality of a small business that operates 8 trucks and is considering electrifying, that is a business challenge. How are they going to manage the logistics? When are they charging? How does it affect scheduling? Meanwhile, the government's putting incentives out there, looking at the electrification to solve a climate challenge. These can be connected, but it has to be done deliberately, so that understanding of where government officials are often coming from. And then on audience, I just give sort of 3 quick groups you want to try and identify. You want to identify your champions, you want to identify who holds the pen, and you want to identify who holds power. Across those 3 groups, there'll be players in both the public service and in the political offices. Understanding and meeting with all of those people is going to just be so key to success in driving things forward. They all play different roles in this.
Go ahead, John.
That was awesome, guys. I wanted to add something that just triggered with me. This disconnect between achieving climate goals and some of the business and investment issues is a really significant area that I think we can really improve on. Climate change is becoming big business. And the scale of transition that has to happen for any jurisdiction, British Columbia, Louisiana, wherever you want to talk about, is hundreds of billions of dollars. And so we need to be a competitive place for capital to be deployed in order to make these transitions happen. We started our new company, CO280, a little over a year and a half ago. We have $4 billion of projects just within our little ecosystem, our little corner, for carbon negative projects and they're all in the US. And Colleen, you mentioned 45Q. that is an incredible program, but Canada has not yet got a competitive response, and therefore a massive amount of capital is being sucked out of Canada and going into the US to deploy carbon negative solutions. And so policy, capital competitiveness, and deployment are all completely connected.
That's a really helpful observation. Thank you. Yeah, capital really is like water. It will flow to where it can easily flow. And it can be quite hard to make water run uphill.
Well, and all your tech companies, Jill, who they're really good at finding where that capital is flowing, because we don't have a lot of time between, you know, Series A and Series B and Series C to find where that capital ends up going, because those are where the customers are.
Exactly. But it is interesting to reflect on. There's such a difference between how business solves problems and how government solves problems. And I think one of the observations I sometimes make, I'd love to hear your reactions to it, is that sort of business is all about opportunity, you know, seizing the opportunity to make profits, build businesses, grow. So it's really fundamentally interested in that half of the equation. And government's really obsessed with problems and disasters, whether it's fixing them or avoiding them or coping with them, but they spend a lot of time thinking about that side of the equation. So business is kind of mystified sometimes by why you wouldn't just pursue all the opportunities you can pursue. But it's perhaps back to that question that you were raising, Evan, about, you know, who is your audience, and they've got a job to do, and they were elected to do a particular kind of job, and it might not be the same perspective as business.
Yeah, I mean, maybe just to react to that, I think the other part of it is, and I can't remember if it was John or Colleen that mentioned this, but the greatest changes we've seen and where it's been sort of moved the farthest, and now people we consider leaders, often stemmed from crisis. And it was sort of the failure or collapse of systems to such a degree that it became a political necessity to address that led to huge shifts. Governments have, I think, for a variety of reasons, aren't always good at being proactive, but in large part that political parties aren't particularly good at being proactive and naming challenges. And I think this defines for me both the BC opportunity and challenge, because from a sort of macro perspective, the BC economy is relatively healthy. We've got strong GDP, there's high employment, like you can go through the high level figures and think things look pretty good. But when you actually look at where prosperity is coming from, when you look at the health of some of the underlying metrics that underpin that, and how we're positioning, it's complacency that we're not being more proactive. We're not working ahead before a collapse. And that, I think, is really that for me is the disconnect, that story that I really want to see told more often, is the supply chains, the prosperity from the energy transition. There are already jurisdictions, including Canadian jurisdictions, working right now to secure that. BC is doing less than they are. And that needs to be a message we start to send an awful lot more clearly.
Great call to action. Thank you. Well, let's see. I feel like we've really explored the policymaking space, and I appreciate that. And it's very useful for a lot of the clean tech companies that we've got on the line. But let's focus a little more on the tech company situation, and perhaps just share some of the fantastic stories that we do have. So I'd love to come to each of you in turn and just tell us a little bit about what are you excited about that you're seeing in BC, made in BC solutions or made in BC initiatives. What do you think is game changing that's happening here? And Colleen, we'll kick off with you.
Be trickier for me, Jill, because I see that the things I would highlight are opportunities in other provinces with my sector. So I think this is again where the complacency and seeing other people chase it a lot more. But you know, I think looking at the renewable electricity space, BC has led the way historically in that level of partnership and collaboration with Indigenous communities. And we've seen some really phenomenal projects be built that are co-owned. It was, you know, 50-50 equity partnerships were happening in our sector long before they were being talked about in others. So I think that's something as we look at this next build and just where the national conversation on UNDRIP and with DRIPA legislation and acknowledgement of how we need to do business in this country going forward, we're poised for have a good foundation in this province and was poised for success.
Let's stay with you for a second, Colleen, because
Mhm.
yeah, tell us what you're excited about that you're seeing elsewhere, because those stories can also be quite inspiring about what we could do here.
Yeah, so Quebec is a good foil. Interjex is headquartered there, so we know that province better than most, but it's also similar to British Columbia in terms of the electricity system being predominantly hydro-based with a portion of wind there. Quebec has leaned in on their clean electricity advantage and have been very proactive in marketing it, both for export and in attracting business to come to the province. This has resulted in approximately 23,000 megawatts of potential industrial demand seeking connection into the grid in the province. And they are now going, sprinting to catch up to try to get the electricity in the system to be able to take advantage of all of that load. So that is factories and businesses and a whole range of job creators and economic engines. So the most recent cabinet that Premier Legault has put in place in Quebec fused the ministries of economic development and electricity together into one chair because they see that opportunity and are wielding it in that way. So you see that happening and kind of go, BC, clearly there's a market out in the world of companies that want to come and set up business and harness renewable electricity. Why are we not promoting that here in this province? Why aren't we putting our shingle out saying, hey, we have a great place, communities like Powell River or Prince George or Williams Lake, places that have had forestry as their backbone for a long time and are struggling, that are great places to raise families, that have connection. Would that not be a good place to try to attract some of these new businesses to come set up shop here? And at the same time, be able to build out more of these, this new generation that we've got a world-class resource here in this province to harness. So I think there's a lot of opportunities in the rest of Canada. And the thing we have to be careful about is, I think my perception is there's long been a feeling that, when we're ready, the capital will just show up, companies will just come and build out and it'll be fine. Well, that's what's happening in Canada. Quebec is first. Ontario is also looking to get 4,000 megawatts of new supply on by 2027. The Western United States, which is just south of us, needs to add 90,000 megawatts. So 90 Site C equivalents of clean electricity by 2035 to meet their clean electricity legislation. And so that competition for capital and for the turbines and for the electricians and create all those pieces is going to be robust. And so if we don't hustle here, we're going to find ourselves going, okay, great, we made the policy choice, this is what we want to do. And crickets, because right now we're building a 300 megawatt wind farm in Wyoming because there was an opportunity there to invest, not in British Columbia.
Very strong contribution there, Colleen. Thank you. And John, I know this is a bit of an obsession of yours, but what are you seeing that's game-changing and exciting, whether it's in BC or it's elsewhere?
Well, I'll talk a little bit about the area that we're focused on in carbon capture and sequestration, because I do see that as one of the really tremendous growth areas in energy transition. Any credible pathway to net zero is going to involve negative carbon emissions, carbon dioxide removal, and putting CO2 back into geologic formations. And so we have seen in the past several years a tremendous demand around the world for carbon capture and sequestration, in particular in the Gulf Coast, which has got the largest concentration of industrial stack emissions of CO2. It's also sitting on top of fantastic geology for deep saline aquifers where we can store CO2 permanently and safely in underground formations. And British Columbia companies are participating in this market. In particular, I'm pretty excited about Svante, what Svante is doing. Svante is a world leader in solid absorbent sequestration technology, carbon capture technology. They recently closed a $300 million financing led by Chevron with participation from the Singapore Sovereign Wealth Fund and GE and United Airlines, and a whole bunch of other investors. They're building a big manufacturing plant in Burnaby, and to supply their customers with carbon capture systems around the world. Carbon Engineering, another BC company. They're on the direct air capture side of things, and they've got a big deal with Occidental, and they're in construction on their first project. Direct air capture is a really promising area of carbon capture. Still very early, but a tremendous growth area. But we're seeing that the combination of attributes to create the ecosystem for carbon capture is really in the Gulf Coast. That's the world leader. All of the competitive requirements: capital, ecosystem, supply chain, geology, and 45Q. Would love to see us. We have the ability to do similar types of things in Canada, certainly in Quebec, absolutely in Alberta, Saskatchewan, and we have some unique attributes in BC. So,
very interesting story is emerging here. I think, yeah, it was complacency was the word that you used, Evan, right? And it sounds like everybody else is moving really, really fast and aggressively. But tell us what you're seeing, that you're excited by, that you think is game changing, that you would share with our audience.
Yeah, and as much as I would say, there's a lot more to do in BC, I also go back to sort of what Colleen said, and I'm as excited about the opportunity for BC because complacency, addressing that today and moving quickly, we do have so many of the key elements for success. And BC does have truly, continent leading for a while, certainly national, leading climate policy. But as we start to move down the path of aligning that with energy policy, thinking about the economic or industrial policy that connects the dots on this, we are going to be one of the spots that could be moving quite quickly and actually making the energy transition a lot more real in a lot more places. And we have a lot of really cool companies that are working on this in a lot of different places. And perhaps even more importantly than the companies is the people. Because I think that for me has always been the success around innovation, or at least the model I think BC should be subscribing to, is that investment in people who want to lead the way, who build many different leading companies across different spaces. I'm as excited by what Teck wants to do in mining and moving so much of their operations to electric trolley assist, to electric vehicles, unlocking critical mineral supply chains in BC, as I am the Mark Rybin's team with Portable Electric and looking at mobile storage solutions and on the call today is Interjex's own Colleen, but the renewable energy companies, the First Nations led projects, there really isn't a story to tell of one single opportunity in one single space. This is a different opportunity in different spaces. You do see CCUS, as John was talking to, opening up a conversation throughout the sort of the northeast of the province, and lots of opportunities up there. You see Kelowna looking at trucking innovation, moving to fully zero emission. We've got some battery conversations starting in the Lower Mainland. Untouched is agriculture, but that is going to be something we are going to be talking an awful lot about in the next 5 years. Because the innovation from a climate side in that space is just rife for companies.
Very interesting. Thank you. Well, I'd like to talk a little bit about industrial policy per se. Thinking sure about BC and Canada, but really thinking sort of globally, bringing our global lens to it. When it works well, what does it look like? If it's not working well, what does it look like? So help us understand what works in industrial policy. And John, I'd love to kick off with you.
Oh man, big topic, Jill. I think, just reflecting back on a lot of the markets that I've worked in, where industrial policy works well is where there's a real alignment between policymakers and industry and capital. You see lots of examples of where governments come into power, Evan touched on this, governments come into power, they've got a mandate, they've got a policy, they've made commitments, and then they implement policy without talking to anybody. And it's particularly industry policy, industrial policy. If you're a government and you try to implement your policy objectives with an industrial policy that is not conscious of the competition and what your competitive advantages are, or who you're competing with, and you don't get input and feedback from the private sector, it will fail. Where it really works well is where that alignment of interests come in, where policy objectives can be achieved, business and investment objectives can be achieved, and there's an alignment of those interests. And I would say that the Inflation Reduction Act was not perfect, but I was involved enough on the periphery of seeing how those discussions happened between what the government wanted to achieve in the US and what emitters could do, and the work that was done in order to get pricing mechanisms and tax credits designed properly to accelerate deployment of. It's not about the volume of tax credits or government money, it's about what it unlocks in private capital, which is at 10x or at 20x. And that's actually starting to happen. So lots of upfront discussions and alignment required to make it happen. So can I go one step further? If we want this to happen in BC, we got to start having a lot more discussions about how these interests can be aligned between the private sector and the government. I think that's absolutely a precondition.
Yeah, that's really great. I have a favorite phrase: hope is not a strategy. Actually need a strategy. Colleen, let's come to you and tell us what you've seen when it works. What does it look like?
Yeah, and I think I'd echo a lot of what Jonathan just shared, and to add a couple more thoughts to it. I think thinking about the social acceptability of the policy and helping, this is where conversation needs to be there, and the private sector and government need to work in tandem on building that support. We've lived a lot of times really great political intent and policy that has created a lot of angst and tension because the citizenry wasn't supporting or hadn't been brought along yet to it being implemented, and it wasn't supported. It's not just government issues something and then walk away and it just happens. There's, just like any project that we would undertake, a lot of work at the beginning, a lot of work during, and a lot of work through the life of it. And I think, and this, I was going to mention this earlier when you were asking for advice on policy too, is we need to try to de-risk some of these things politically. And so it can't just be one party who supports it. And so we need to be talking across the political spectrum, because these are long-term investments. Hopefully we're building businesses and projects that are going to last for decades. And so they need to be durable. And the political and policy ecosystem that we're investing into needs to be a durable one. And increasingly, as you know, I'm looking at the advice I'm giving our developers and C-suite on when they're going to unlock that capital to invest. The durability from a political and policy perspective of the jurisdiction is increasingly something that we're focusing on, as we're heading now into decades likely that we'll have a lot more instability. And then the other point I just wanted to double down on is the working in partnership in terms of how do you actually implement it. So here's your policy intention, but work with those companies that have to implement on the ground to understand what's actually necessary. What are the pieces that we need to be able to achieve those results so that your policy is successful? And just end with one last thought on a part of the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States that is done very astutely on this, is that from the renewable electricity side, most of the growth is now going to be focused into red districts. And so it is Republican voters that are going to benefit the most from the job creation, which will lend itself to it being a more durable policy for the long term, because it will be very hard for Republican Congress people and senators to walk back these policy when it's their constituents that are benefiting from the jobs. So something to think about as we deploy ours.
Great observations there. Evan, will you close us off?
Yeah. Yeah, can't say enough good things about what both Colleen and John said about best practices there. I think one of the most like current examples of energy transition meets industrial policy that I always point to is the European Battery Alliance. I think the entirety of how that conversation started, the deliberateness of bringing together, industry, government, academia, labor, having a real conversation, and then critically not just engaging and then implementing, engaging through implementation, and that the implementation side of the European Battery Alliance integrates business in the actual deployment of this strategy. And you can see it in how they're targeting specific investments into specific countries to build sustainable supply chains. And Europe has gone to a place where it's rapidly approaching battery leadership expertise that 10 years ago it wasn't even on the map. Like it wasn't in the conversation. So it can really be really successful. I think some of the like really fundamental underpinnings of it, I would again just reiterate that collaborative environment between policymakers and industry, really good data that's constantly collected and leveraged, really clear articulation of objectives. I think one of the big risks that the Canadian political system as a whole kind of introduces as a risk is the little bit for everyone to bring together the maximum coalitions you need electorally, which does very little to secure competitive advantages and actually go long on some of the places we could really win. So I think there is a risk of not having specific, clear objectives and choices that we're making. And then lastly, we need to understand and quantify our competitive advantages better. I think the Volkswagen announcement over in Ontario is potentially great news, potentially in the long run for the battery supply chain in Canada. It could be a huge anchor, except what we don't have is a battery strategy in Canada. We don't really know how we're going to leverage it to unlock supply chains across the rest of Canada. And it's a very expensive proposition if it's going to be one-off deals with individual companies. If we had a better evaluation of how much of a premium are companies putting on things like clean electricity, how do we really quantify that so that we're not just going to compete with US states who are going to be money rich on the approach, because that's the only climate policy they can really advance, but that we can really, Canadian politicians, public service really has an estimation of how much our clean electricity is worth and who values it, to be able to go into negotiations from a position of strength. I really can't say enough about the sort of competitive advantage side, understanding where Canada sits in the sort of emerging supply chains as where we need to start when it comes to industrial policy.
I really appreciate that emphasis on, where can you win? Invest where you can win, invest where the markets are big enough, invest where you have a competitive advantage. Really the opposite of hope as a strategy. Now, listen, time has somewhat run away with me because this conversation is so interesting. So I very much appreciate you. I just want to ask my audience, first of all, I should at least let them get one question in if I can. So if anybody wants to, please just raise your hand or put your question in the chat.
I've got one. Can I throw it your way?
Please.
Thanks so much. Great to hear from all of you, and really like the insights. Going back to competitive advantage, I think that we've got a culture in Southwest BC that is very clean tech and climate supportive. Greenpeace started here. The first green MPs were from here. We've got 25% of Canada's clean tech companies, despite only having about 13% of the population. But I worry that superpower we have around green culture is offset by a limited manufacturing ecosystem in BC, and maybe even a perception that manufacturing, whether it's clean tech or not, means polluting smokestacks. And that's an issue, because most clean tech is hardware, and hardware is hard. Supply chain issues, long development cycles, CapEx intensive, industrial space is needed. Despite that, we're seeing a swell of clean tech companies, but I'm seeing more and more of those solutions being produced offshore, where maybe the high standards that we have around labor or environmental regulations aren't as strong. And so the question would be, how do we have maybe some of that political perception change regarding clean tech manufacturing or manufacturing in BC in general? And how do we support more of that manufacturing to happen in here so that we can help those companies scale?
Super question. Who'd like to go first?
I've got a partial response. Yeah, go ahead, Colleen. I've got a response too.
Well, you go first, Evan, and then I'll jump in because what I've got is probably a better follow on.
Yeah, so I think there's a few things. I in general, I would really agree that we are, BC does not take the steps it should be yet. And I'd say this is like beyond just the sort of geographic region you described. I think this is a broader problem. Like manufacturing needs to be a bigger part of the conversation. I do think we need to come at it from that perspective of understanding where we can really compete. I've heard conversations of like, well, let's bring car manufacturing to British Columbia for the battery supply chain where we can build cars here. That probably wouldn't be where I would start, given all of the other industries where we've already got a footprint. I do think some of the how do we unlock action on this comes back to where we started, which is storytelling, which is really clearly articulating what is the gap, what is the opportunity, in which areas, what does it unlock? I don't know that it necessarily needs to be from a place of, we've got too strong, ESG provisions to secure that. I almost turn that around because I think supply chain security is creeping up there in terms of it's not just about low cost supply chain, it's about secure supply chain, it's about value driven supply chain. So who are the partners out there that value those things as well, that align with the areas where we really have a head start, or at least those small companies that could feed into? And then how do we tell that story? I'd look at Bécancour in Quebec. Colleen mentioned it. It's such an excellent example of proactive government putting in place the physical infrastructure, the physical location, and then going out and matching companies. They knew who they wanted and they connected waste streams to supply streams. And it's such a good example of well done Canadian policy around manufacturing.
See, I knew you were going to say that, which is where I fit better second, Evan. But I think just to add to that, I think in the storytelling, it's being aware that we're heading into a new trade dynamic. Like COVID, if it taught us nothing, should teach us that global supply chains are incredibly fragile. I've passed my eloquence ratio for today. And we're seeing this already with the United States and putting in barriers for the importation of some of the solar panels from China. And again, looking ahead, I don't think trade relationships or the geopolitical ecosystem is going to be more favorable to North America-Chinese relations over the decades to come. And so we have an opportunity here, it's Fortress North America, we're leaning in. We have one of the largest markets globally south of the border to us. And it's not replacing what Eastern Canada has, it's looking what's missing. What do we have here in this province? California is one of the largest economies in the world and is just south of us. We've already got, through the Pacific Coast Collaborative, strong political connectivity on climate and economy with the governors heading down the Western seaboard. And so I think it's, again, leaning in on that story and looking at what is the world we're heading into and how do we seize those opportunities for this province. And, there's lots of add-ons to the storytelling, but I think at the root of it, this is a security issue. Energy security, food security, material security, economic security, and being able to rely closer to home.
John, do you want to have the last word?
My friend Dean has asked a very good question here. I mean, we do not have a manufacturing ethos here in British Columbia. We just don't really value it, but we're not very competitive in a lot of respects either. And so, when you're thinking about manufacturing something, I think we can do lots of assembly here, but when you think about manufacturing, you need to any company that's thinking about manufacturing, especially clean tech manufacturing is often high tech, right? So there's lots of different components. I just think about my last company. We had supply chain scattered from Asia to North America to Europe, and we're bringing high tech components into British Columbia to assemble them and then ship them out. But if you think about manufacturing, it's about speed, security, supply chain access, labor, talent, regulation, and so when you run through all your criteria, you often do not come up with BC as the best place to do that. So it's just a reality, right? but I think there are spots that we can leverage our competitive advantages that may make a lot of sense. So that's, to me, I think, Evan's put his finger on it, which is like, we got to focus on what we're really good at and what our competitive advantages are. And
Thank
if
you
we
all.
do that, then we'll make the right choices.
Thank you. That was
Thank you
great.
so much. Really great question, Dean. Thank you for that. And thanks to our panelists. We're out of time. So I am going to give you one final bon mot. In addition to hope is not a strategy, don't argue with reality. It always wins. Just accept reality and then come up with your game plan for how you can use reality to achieve your strategy.